Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 14. Sunday Bells. Heidi was standing under the waving fir trees waiting for her grandfather, who was going down with her to grandmother's, and then on to Dorfli to fetch her box. She was longing to know how grandmother had enjoyed her white bread, and impatient to see and hear her again, but no time seemed weary to her now, for she could not listen long enough to the familiar voice of the trees, or drink in too much of the fragrance wafted to her from the green pastures where the golden-headed flowers were glowing in the sun, a very feast to her eyes. The grandfather came out, gave a look round, and then called to her in a cheerful voice, "Well, now we can be off." It was Saturday, a day when Alm uncle made everything clean and tidy inside and outside the house. He had devoted his morning to this work so as to be able to accompany Heidi in the afternoon, and the whole place was now as spick and span as he liked to see it. They parted at the grandmother's cottage, and Heidi ran in. The grandmother had heard her steps approaching, and greeted her as she crossed the threshold. "Is it you, child? Have you come again?" Then she took hold of Heidi's hand, and held it fast in her own, for she still seemed to fear that the child might be torn from her again. And now she had to tell Heidi how much she had enjoyed the white bread, and how much stronger she felt already for having been able to eat it. And then Peter's mother went on and said she was sure that if her mother could eat like that for a week, she would get back some of her strength, but she was so afraid of coming to the end of the rolls that she had only eaten one as yet. Heidi listened to all Brigitte said, and sat thinking for a while. Then she suddenly thought of a way. "I know, grandmother, what I will do," she said eagerly. "I will write to Clara, and she will send me as many rolls again, if not twice as many as you have already, for I had ever such a large heap in the wardrobe, and when they were all taken away she promised to give me as many back, and she would do so, I am sure." "That is a good idea," said Brigitte, "but then they would get hard and stale. The baker in Dorfli makes the white rolls, and if we could get some of those he has over now and then, but I can only just manage to pay for the black bread." A further bright thought came to Heidi, and with a look of joy, "Oh, I have lots of money, grandmother!" she cried gleefully, skipping about the room in her delight. "And I know now what I will do with it. You must have a fresh white roll every day, and 2 on Sunday, and Peter can bring them up from Dorfli." "No, no, child," answered the grandmother. "I cannot let you do that. The money was not given to you for that purpose. You must give it to your grandfather, and he will tell you how you are to spend it." But Heidi was not to be hindered in her kind intentions, and she continued to jump about, saying over and over again in a tone of exultation, "Now grandmother can have a roll every day, and will grow quite strong again, and, oh, grandmother!" she suddenly exclaimed with an increase of jubilation in her voice, "if you get strong, everything will grow light again for you. Perhaps it's only because you are weak that it is dark." The grandmother said nothing. She did not wish to spoil the child's pleasure. As she went jumping about, Heidi suddenly caught sight of the grandmother's song-book, and another happy idea struck her. "Grandmother, I can also read now. Would you like me to read you one of your hymns from your old book?" "Oh, yes!" said the grandmother, surprised and delighted. "But can you really read, child, really?" Heidi had climbed onto a chair, and had already lifted down the book, bringing a cloud of dust with it, for it had lain untouched on the shelf for a long time. Heidi wiped it, sat herself down on a stool beside the old woman, and asked her which hymn she should read. "What you like, child, what you like," and the grandmother pushed her spinning-wheel aside, and sat in eager expectation, waiting for Heidi to begin. Heidi turned over the leaves and read a line out softly to herself here and there. At last she said, "Here is one about the sun, grandmother. I will read you that." And Heidi began, reading with more and more warmth of expression as she went on. "The morning breaks, and warm and bright the earth lies still in the golden light, for dawn has scattered the clouds of night. God's handiwork is seen around, things great and small to his praise abound. Where are the signs of his love not found? All things must pass, but God shall still with steadfast power his will fulfill. Sure and unshaken is his will. His saving grace will never fail, though grief and fear the heart assail, o'er life's wild seas he will prevail. Joy shall be ours in that garden blest, where after storm we find our rest. I wait in peace. God's time is best." The grandmother sat with folded hands and a look of indescribable joy on her face, such as Heidi had never seen there before, although at the same time the tears were running down her cheeks. As Heidi finished, she implored her, saying, "Read it once again, child, just once again." And the child began again, with as much pleasure in the verses as the grandmother. "Joy shall be ours in that garden blest, where after storm we find our rest. I wait in peace. God's time is best." "Ah, Heidi, that brings light to the heart. What comfort you have brought me!" And the old woman kept on repeating the glad words, while Heidi beamed with happiness, and she could not take her eyes away from the grandmother's face, which had never looked like that before. It had no longer the old troubled expression, but was alight with peace and joy, as if she were already looking with clear new eyes into the garden of paradise. Some one now knocked at the window, and Heidi looked up and saw her grandfather beckoning her to come home with him. She promised the grandmother, before leaving her, that she would be with her the next day, and even if she went out with Peter she would only spend half the day with him, for the thought that she might make it light and happy again for the grandmother gave her the greatest pleasure, greater even than being out on the sunny mountain with the flowers and goats. As she was going out, Brigitte ran to her with the frock and hat she had left. Heidi put the dress over her arm, for, as she thought to herself, the grandfather had seen that before, but she obstinately refused to take back the hat. Brigitte could keep it, for she should never put it on her head again. Heidi was so full of her morning's doings that she began at once to tell her grandfather all about them, how the white bread could be fetched every day from Dorfli if there was money for it, and how the grandmother had all at once grown stronger and happier, and light had come to her. Then she returned to the subject of the rolls. "If the grandmother won't take the money, grandfather, will you give it all to me, and I can then give Peter enough every day to buy a roll, and 2 on Sunday." "But how about the bed?" said her grandfather. "It would be nice for you to have a proper bed, and there would then be plenty for the bread." But Heidi gave her grandfather no peace till he consented to do what she wanted. She slept a great deal better, she said, on her bed of hay than on her fine pillowed bed in Frankfort. So at last he said, "The money is yours. Do what you like with it. You can buy bread for grandmother for years to come with it." Heidi shouted for joy at the thought that grandmother would never need any more to eat hard black bread, and, "Oh, grandfather," she said, "everything is happier now than it has ever been in our lives before," and she sang and skipped along, holding her grandfather's hand as light-hearted as a bird. But all at once she grew quiet and said, "If God had let me come at once, as I prayed, then everything would have been different. I should only have had a little bread to bring to grandmother, and I should not have been able to read, which is such a comfort to her. But God has arranged it all so much better than I knew how to. Everything has happened just as the other grandmothers said it would. Oh, how glad I am that God did not let me have at once all I prayed and wept for. And now I shall always pray to God as she told me, and always thank him, and when he does not do anything I ask for, I shall think to myself, it's just like it was in Frankfurt. God, I am sure, is going to do something better still. So we will pray every day, won't we, grandfather, and never forget him again, or else he may forget us. And supposing one does forget him, said the grandfather in a low voice. Then everything goes wrong, for God lets us then go where we like, and when we get poor and miserable, and begin to cry about it, no one pities us, but they say, you ran away from God, and so God, who could have helped you, left you to yourself. That is true, Heidi. Where did you learn all that? From grandmamma. She explained it all to me. The grandfather walked on for a little while without speaking. Then he said, as if following his own train of thought, and if it once is so, it is so always. No one can go back, and he whom God has forgotten is forgotten forever. Oh, no, grandfather, we can go back, for grandmamma told me so, and so it was in the beautiful tale in my book. But you have not heard that yet, but we shall be home directly now, and then I will read it to you, and you will see how beautiful it is. And in her eagerness Heidi struggled faster and faster up the steep ascent, and they were no sooner at the top than she let go her grandfather's hand and ran into the hut. The grandfather slung the basket off his shoulders, in which he had brought up a part of the contents of the trunk which was too heavy to carry up as it was. Then he sat down on his seat and began thinking. Heidi soon came running out with her book under her arm. "That's right, grandfather," she exclaimed, as she saw he had already taken his seat. And in a second she was beside him, and had her book open at the particular tale, for she had read it so often that the leaves fell open at it of their own accord. And now, in a sympathetic voice, Heidi began to read of the son when he was happily at home, and went out into the fields with his father's flocks, and was dressed in a fine cloak, and stood leaning on his shepherd's staff watching as the sun went down, just as he was to be seen in the picture. But then all at once he wanted to have his own goods and money, and to be his own master, and so he asked his father to give him his portion, and he left his home and went, and wasted all his substance. And when he had nothing left, he hired himself out to a master who had no flocks and fields like his father, but only swine to keep, and so he was obliged to watch these, and he only had rags to wear, and a few husks to eat, such as the swine fed upon. And then he thought of his old happy life at home, and of how kindly his father had treated him, and how ungrateful he had been, and he wept for sorrow and longing. And he thought to himself, "I will arise and go to my father, and say to him, 'Father, I am not worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants.' And when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him." Here Heidi paused in her reading. "What do you think happens now, grandfather?" she said. "Do you think the father is still angry and will say to him, 'I told you so'? Well, listen now to what comes next." His father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry, for this my son was dead, and is alive again, he was lost, and is found." And they began to be merry. "Isn't that a beautiful tale, grandfather?" said Heidi, as the latter continued to sit without speaking. for she had expected him to express pleasure and astonishment. "You are right, Heidi. It is a beautiful tale," he replied, but he looked so grave as he said it that Heidi grew silent herself and sat looking quietly at her pictures. Presently she pushed her book gently in front of him and said, "See how happy he is there!" And she pointed with her finger to the figure of the returned prodigal, who was standing by his father, clad in fresh raiment as one of his own sons again. A few hours later, as Heidi lay fast asleep in her bed, the grandfather went up the ladder and put his lamp down near her bed, so that the light fell on the sleeping child. Her hands were still folded as if she had fallen asleep saying her prayers. An expression of peace and trust lay on the little face, and something in it seemed to appeal to the grandfather, for he stood a long time gazing down at her without speaking. At last he too folded his hands, and with bowed head said in a low voice, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am not worthy to be called thy son." And 2 large tears rolled down the old man's cheeks. Early the next morning he stood in front of his hut and gazed quietly around him. The fresh, bright morning sun lay on mountain and valley. The sound of a few early bells rang up from the valley, and the birds were singing their morning song in the fir-trees. He stepped back into the hut and called up, "Come along, Heidi, the sun is up. Put on your best frock, for we are going to church together." Heidi was not long getting ready. It was such an unusual summons from her grandfather that she must make haste. She put on her smart Frankfurt dress and soon went down. But when she saw her grandfather she stood still, gazing at him in astonishment. "Why, grandfather!" she exclaimed. "I never saw you look like that before. And the coat with the silver buttons! Oh, you do look nice in your Sunday coat." The old man smiled and replied, "And you too. Now come along." He took Heidi's hand in his, and together they walked down the mountainside. The bells were ringing in every direction now, sounding louder and fuller as they neared the valley, and Heidi listened to them with delight. "Hark at them, grandfather! It's like a great festival." The congregation had already assembled, and the singing had begun when Heidi and her grandfather entered the church at Dorfli and sat down at the back. But before the hymn was over, every one was nudging his neighbor and whispering, "Do you see? Alm Uncle is in church." Soon everybody in the church knew of Alm Uncle's presence, and the women kept on turning round to look, and quite lost their place in the singing. But everybody became more attentive when the sermon began, for the preacher spoke with such warmth and thankfulness that those present felt the effect of his words, as if some great joy had come to them all. At the close of the service, Alm Uncle took Heidi by the hand, and on leaving the church made his way towards the pastor's house. The rest of the congregation looked curiously after him, some even following to see whether he went inside the pastor's house, which he did. Then they collected in groups and talked over this strange event, keeping their eyes on the pastor's door, watching to see whether Alm Uncle came out looking angry and quarrelsome, or as if the interview had been a peaceful one, for they could not imagine what had brought the old man down, and what it all meant. Some, however, adopted a new tone, and expressed their opinion that Alm Uncle was not so bad after all as they had thought. "For see how carefully he took the little one by the hand." And others responded and said they had always thought people had exaggerated about him, that if he was so downright bad he would be afraid to go inside the pastor's house. Then the miller put in his word. "Did I not tell you so from the first? What child is there who would run away from where she had plenty to eat and drink and everything of the best, home to a grandfather who was cruel and unkind, and of whom she was afraid. And so everybody began to feel quite friendly towards Alm Uncle, and the women now came up and related all they had been told by Peter and his grandmother, and finally they all stood there like people waiting for an old friend whom they had long missed from among their number. Meanwhile, Alm Uncle had gone into the pastor's house and knocked at the study door. The latter came out and greeted him, not as if he was surprised to see him, but as if he had quite expected to see him there. He probably had caught sight of the old man in church. He shook hands warmly with him, and Alm Uncle was unable at first to speak, for he had not expected such a friendly reception. At last he collected himself and said, "I have come to ask you, pastor, to forget the words I spoke to you when you called on me, and to beg you not to owe me ill will for having been so obstinately set against your well-meant advice. You were right, and I was wrong, but I have now made up my mind to follow your advice, and to find a place for myself at Dorfli for the winter, for the child is not strong enough to stand the bitter cold up on the mountain. And if the people down here look askance at me, as at a person not to be trusted, I know it is my own fault, and you will, I am sure, not do so." The pastor's kindly eyes shone with pleasure. He pressed the old man's hand in his, and said with emotion, "Neighbor, you went into the right church before you came to mine. I am greatly rejoiced. You will not repent coming to live with us again. As for myself, you will always be welcome as a dear friend and neighbor. And I look forward to our spending many a pleasant winter evening together, for I shall prize your companionship, and we will find some nice friends, too, for the little one." And the pastor laid his hand kindly on the child's curly head, and took her by the hand as he walked to the door with the old man. He did not say good-bye to him till they were standing outside, so that all the people standing about saw him shake hands, as if parting reluctantly from his best friend. The door had hardly shut behind him before the whole congregation now came forward to greet Alm Uncle, every one striving to be the first to shake hands with him, and so many were held out that Alm Uncle did not know which to begin with, and some said, "We are so pleased to see you among us again," and another, "I have long been wishing we could have a talk together again," and greetings of all kinds echoed from every side, and when Alm Uncle told them he was thinking of returning to his old quarters in Dorfli for the winter, there was such a general chorus of pleasure that anyone would have thought he was the most beloved person in all Dorfli, and that they had hardly known how to live without him. Most of his friends accompanied him and Heidi some way up the mountain, and each, as they bid him good-bye, made him promise that when he next came down he would without fail come and call. As the old man at last stood alone with the child, watching their retreating figures, there was a light upon his face, as if reflected from some inner sunshine of heart. Heidi, looking up at him with her clear, steady eyes, said, "Grandfather, you look nicer and nicer to-day. I never saw you quite like that before." "Do you think so?" he answered with a smile. "Well, yes, Heidi, I am happier to-day than I deserve, happier than I had thought possible. It is good to be at peace with God and man. God was good to me when he sent you to my hut." When they reached Peter's home, the grandfather opened the door and walked straight in. "Good morning, grandmother," he said. "I think we shall have to do some more patching up before the autumn winds come." "Dear God, if it is not uncle!" cried the grandmother in pleased surprise. "That I should live to see such a thing, and now I can thank you for all that you have done for me. May God reward you. May God reward you." She stretched out a trembling hand to him, and when the grandfather shook it warmly, she went on, still holding his. "And I have something on my heart I want to say, a prayer to make to you. If I have injured you in any way, do not punish me by sending the child away again, before I lie under the grass. Oh, you do not know what that child is to me." And she clasped the child to her, for Heidi had already taken her usual stand close to the grandmother. "Have no fear, grandmother," said uncle in a reassuring voice. "I shall not punish either you or myself by doing so. We are all together now, and pray God we may continue so for long." Brigitte now drew the uncle aside towards a corner of the room, and showed him the hat with the feathers, explaining to him how it came there, and adding that of course she could not take such a thing from a child. But the grandfather looked towards Heidi without any displeasure of countenance, and said, "The hat is hers, and if she does not wish to wear it any more, she has a right to say so, and to give it to you. So take it, pray." Brigitte was highly delighted at this. "It is well worth more than 10 shillings," she said as she held it up for further admiration. "And what a blessing Heidi has brought home with her from Frankfurt! I have thought sometimes that it might be good to send Peter there for a little while. What do you think, uncle?" A merry look came into the grandfather's eye. He thought it would do Peter no harm, but he had better wait for a good opportunity before starting. At this moment the subject of their conversation himself rushed in, evidently in a great hurry, knocking his head violently against the door in his haste, so that everything in the room rattled. Gasping and breathless, he stood still after this, and held out a letter. This was another great event, for such a thing had never happened before. The letter was addressed to Heidi, and had been delivered at the post-office in Dorfli. They all sat down round the table to hear what was in it, for Heidi opened it at once, and read it without hesitation. The letter was from Clara. The latter wrote that the house had been so dull since Heidi left that she did not know how to bear herself, and she had at last persuaded her father to take her to the baths at Ragatz in the coming autumn. Grandmamma had arranged to join them there, and they both were looking forward to paying her and her grandfather a visit. And Grandmamma sent a further message to Heidi, which was that the latter had done quite right to take the rolls to the grandmother, and so that she might not have to eat them dry, she was sending some coffee, which was already on its way, and Grandmamma hoped when she came to the Alm in the autumn that Heidi would take her to see her old friend. There were exclamations of pleasure and astonishment on hearing all this news, and so much to talk and ask about that even the grandfather did not notice how the time was passing. There was general delight at the thought of the coming days, and even more at the meeting which had taken place on this one, and the grandmother spoke and said, "The happiest of all things is when an old friend comes and greets us as in former times. The heart is comforted with the assurance that some day everything that we have loved will be given back to us. You will come again soon, uncle, and you, child, tomorrow?" The old man and Heidi promised her faithfully to do so. Then it was time to break up the party, and these two went back up the mountain. As they had been greeted with bells when they made their journey down in the morning, so now they were accompanied by the peaceful evening chimes as they climbed to the hut, which had quite a Sunday-like appearance as it stood bathed in the light of the low evening sun. But when Grandmamma comes next autumn, there will be many fresh joys and surprises both for Heidi and grandmother. Without doubt a proper bed will be put up in the hay-loft, for wherever Grandmamma steps in, there everything is soon in right order, outside and in. End of chapter 14. Read by Kara Shallenberg on April 20th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 15. Preparations for a Journey. The kind doctor, who had given the order that Heidi was to be sent home, was walking along one of the broad streets towards Herr Sesamann's house. It was a sunny September morning, so full of light and sweetness that it seemed as if everybody must rejoice. But the doctor walked with his eyes fastened to the ground, and did not once lift them to the blue sky above him. There was an expression of sadness on his face, formerly so cheerful, and his hair had grown grayer since the spring. The doctor had had an only daughter, who, after his wife's death, had been his sole and constant companion, but only a few months previously death had deprived him of his dear child, and he had never been the same bright and cheery man since. Sebastian opened the door to him, greeting him with every mark of respectful civility, for the doctor was not only the most cherished friend of the master and his daughter, but had by his kindness won the hearts of the whole household. "Everything as usual, Sebastian?" asked the doctor in his pleasant voice, as he preceded Sebastian up the stairs. "I am glad you have come, doctor," exclaimed Herr Sesemann, as the latter entered. "We must really have another talk over this Swiss journey. Do you still adhere to your decision, even though Clara is decidedly improving in health?" "My dear Sesemann, I never knew such a man as you," said the doctor, as he sat down beside his friend. "I really wish your mother was here. Everything would be clear and straightforward then, and she would soon put things in right train. You sent for me 3 times yesterday only to ask me the same question, though you know what I think." "Yes, I know. It's enough to make you out of patience with me, but you must understand, dear friend," and Herr Sesemann laid his hand imploringly on the doctor's shoulder, "that I feel I have not the courage to refuse the child what I have been promising her all along, and for months now she has been living on the thought of it day and night. She bore this last bad attack so patiently because she was buoyed up with the hope that she should soon start on her Swiss journey, and see her friend Heidi again. And now I must tell the poor child, who has to give up so many pleasures, that this visit she has so long looked forward to must also be cancelled. I really have not the courage to do it." "You must make up your mind to it, Sesemann," said the doctor with authority, and as his friend continued silent and dejected, he went on after a pause. "Consider yourself how the matter stands. Clara has not had such a bad summer as this last one for years. Only the worst results would follow from the fatigue of such a journey, and it is out of the question for her. And then we are already in September, and although it may still be warm and fine up there, it may just as likely be already very cold. The days, too, are growing short, and as Clara cannot spend the night up there, she would only have a 2 hours' visit at the outside. The journey from Ragatz would take hours, for she would have to be carried up the mountain in a chair. In short, Sesemann, it is impossible. But I will go in with you and talk to Clara. She is a reasonable child, and I will tell her what my plans are. Next May she shall be taken to the baths, and stay there for the cure until it is quite hot weather. Then she can be carried up the mountain from time to time, and when she is stronger she will enjoy these excursions far more than she would now. Understand, Sesemann, that if we want to give the child a chance of recovery, we must use the utmost care and watchfulness." Herr Sesemann, who had listened to the doctor in sad and submissive silence, now suddenly jumped up. "Doctor," he said, "tell me truly, have you really any hope of her final recovery?" The doctor shrugged his shoulders. "Very little," he replied quietly. "But, friend, think of my trouble. You have still a beloved child to look for you and greet you on your return home. You do not come back to an empty house and sit down to a solitary meal. And the child is happy and comfortable at home, too. If there is much that she has to give up, she has on the other hand many advantages. No, Sesemann, you are not so greatly to be pitied. You have still the happiness of being together. Think of my lonely house." Herr Sesemann was now striding up and down the room, as was his habit when deeply engaged in thought. Suddenly he came to a pause beside his friend, and laid his hand on his shoulder. "Doctor, I have an idea. I cannot bear to see you look as you do. You are no longer the same man. You must be taken out of yourself for a while, and what do you think I propose? That you shall take the journey and go and pay Heidi a visit in our name." The doctor was taken aback at this sudden proposal, and wanted to make objections, but his friend gave him no time to say anything. He was so delighted with his idea that he seized the doctor by the arm and drew him into Clara's room. The kind doctor was always a welcome visitor to Clara, for he generally had something amusing to tell her. Lately, it is true, he had been graver, but Clara knew the reason why, and would have given much to see him his old lively self again. She held out her hand to him as he came up to her. He took a seat beside her, and her father also drew up his chair, and, taking Clara's hand in his, began to talk to her of the Swiss journey, and how he himself had looked forward to it. He passed as quickly as he could over the main point that it was now impossible for her to undertake it, for he dreaded the tears that would follow, but he went on without pause to tell her of his new plan, and dwelt on the great benefit it would be to his friend if he could be persuaded to take this holiday. The tears were indeed swimming in the blue eyes, although Clara struggled to keep them down for her father's sake, but it was a bitter disappointment to give up the journey, the thought of which had been her only joy and solace during the lonely hours of her long illness. She knew, however, that her father would never refuse her a thing unless he was certain that it would be harmful for her. So she swallowed her tears as well as she could, and turned her thoughts to the one hope still left her. Taking the doctor's hand and stroking it, she said pleadingly, "Dear doctor, you will go and see Heidi, won't you? And then you can come and tell me all about it, what it is like up there, and what Heidi and the grandfather and Peter and the goats do all day. I know them all so well. And then you can take what I want to send to Heidi. I have thought about it all, and also something for the grandmother. Do pray go, dear doctor, and I will take as much cod-liver oil as you like." Whether this promise finally decided the doctor, it is impossible to say, but it is certain that he smiled and said, "Then I must certainly go, Clara, for you will then get as plump and strong as your father, and I wish to see you. And have you decided when I am to start?" "Tomorrow morning, early if possible," replied Clara. "Yes, she is right," put in Herr Sesemann. "The sun is shining and the sky is blue, and there is no time to be lost. It is a pity to miss a single one of these days on the mountain." The doctor could not help laughing. "You will be reproaching me next for not being there already. Well, I must go and make arrangements for getting off." But Clara would not let him go until she had given him endless messages for Heidi, and had explained all he was to look at, so as to give her an exact description on his return. Her presents she would send round later, as Fräulein Rottenmeier must first help her to pack them up. At that moment she was out on one of her excursions into the town, which always kept her engaged for some time. The doctor promised to obey Clara's directions in every particular. He would start some time during the following day, if not the first thing in the morning, and would bring back a faithful account of his experiences, and of all he saw and heard. The servants of a household have a curious faculty of divining what is going on before they are actually told about anything. Sebastian and Tinette must have possessed this faculty in a high degree, for even as the doctor was going downstairs, Tinette, who had been rung for, entered Clara's room. "Take that box and bring it back filled with the soft cakes which we have with coffee," said Clara, pointing to a box which had been brought long before in preparation for this. Tinette took it up and carried it out, dangling it contemptuously in her hand. "Hardly worth the trouble, I should have thought," she said pertly, as she left the room. As Sebastian opened the door for the doctor, he said with a bow, "Will the Herr Doctor be so kind as to give the little miss my greetings?" "I see," said the doctor. "You know then already that I am off on a journey." Sebastian hesitated, and gave an awkward little cough. I hardly know myself. Oh, yes, I remember. I happened to pass through the dining-room, and caught little Miss's name, and I put two and two together, so I thought—" I see, smiled the doctor. "One can find out a great many things by thinking. Good-bye till I see you again, Sebastian. I will be sure and give your message." The doctor was hastening off when he met with a sudden obstacle. The violent wind had prevented Fräulein Rottenmeier prosecuting her walk any farther, and she was just returning, and had reached the door as he was coming out. The white shawl she wore was so blown out by the wind that she looked like a ship in full sail. The doctor drew back, but Fräulein Rottenmeier had always evinced peculiar appreciation and respect for this man, and she also drew back with exaggerated politeness to let him pass. The two stood for a few seconds, each anxious to make way for the other. But a sudden gust of wind sent Fräulein Rottenmeier flying with all her sails almost into the doctor's arms, and she had to pause and recover herself before she could shake hands with the doctor with becoming decorum. She was put out at having been forced to enter in so undignified a manner, but the doctor had a way of smoothing people's ruffled feathers, and she was soon listening with her usual composure while he informed her of his intended journey, begging her in his most conciliatory voice to pack up the parcels for Heidi as she alone knew how to pack. And then he took his leave. Clara quite expected to have a long tussle with Fräulein Rottenmeier before she would get the latter to consent to sending all the things that she had collected as presents for Heidi. But this time she was mistaken, for Fräulein Rottenmeier was in a more than usually good temper. She cleared the large table so that all the things for Heidi could be spread out upon it, and packed under Clara's own eyes. It was no light job, for the presents were of all shapes and sizes. First there was the little warm cloak with a hood, which had been designed by Clara herself, in order that Heidi during the coming winter might be able to go and see grandmother when she liked, and not have to wait till her grandfather could take her wrapped up in a sack to keep her from freezing. Then came a thick warm shawl for the grandmother, in which she could wrap herself well up, and not feel the cold when the wind came sweeping in such terrible gusts round the house. The next object was the large box full of cakes. These were also for the grandmother, that she might have something to eat with her coffee besides bread. An immense sausage was the next article. This had been originally intended for Peter, who never had anything but bread and cheese, but Clara had altered her mind, fearing that in his delight he might eat it all up at once and make himself ill. So she arranged to send it to Brigitta, who could take some for herself and the grandmother, and give Peter his portion out by degrees. A packet of tobacco was a present for grandfather, who was fond of his pipe as he sat resting in the evening. Finally there was a whole lot of mysterious little bags and parcels and boxes, which Clara had especial pleasure in collecting, as each was to be a joyful surprise for Heidi as she opened it. The work came to an end at last, and an imposing-looking package lay on the floor, ready for transport. Fräulein Rottenmeier looked at it with satisfaction, lost in the consideration of the art of packing. Clara eyed it too with pleasure, picturing Heidi's exclamations and jumps of joy and surprise when the huge parcel arrived at the hut. And now Sebastian came in, and lifting the package onto his shoulder, carried it off to be forwarded at once to the doctor's house. End of chapter 15. Read by Shallenberg on April 20th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi. Chapter 16. A Visitor. The early light of morning lay rosy red upon the mountains, and a fresh breeze rustled through the fir-trees, and set their ancient branches waving to and fro. The sound awoke Heidi, and she opened her eyes. The roaring in the trees always stirred a strong emotion within her, and seemed to draw her irresistibly to them. So she jumped out of bed, and dressed herself as quickly as she could, but it took her some time even then, for she was careful now to be always clean and tidy. When she went down her ladder, she found her grandfather had already left the hut. He was standing outside, looking at the sky, and examining the landscape as he did every morning, to see what sort of weather it was going to be. Little pink clouds were floating over the sky, that was growing brighter and bluer with every minute, while the heights and the meadowlands were turning gold under the rising sun, which was just appearing above the topmost peaks. "Oh, how beautiful, how beautiful! Good morning, grandfather!" cried Heidi, running out. "What, you are awake already, are you?" he answered, giving her a morning greeting. Then Heidi ran round to the fir-trees to enjoy the sound she loved so well, and with every fresh gust of wind which came roaring through their branches, she gave a fresh jump and cry of delight. Meanwhile the grandfather had gone to milk the goats. This done, he brushed and washed them, ready for their mountain excursion, and brought them out of their shed. As soon as Heidi caught sight of her two friends, she ran and embraced them, and they bleated in return, while they vied with each other in showing their affection by poking their heads against her, and trying which could get nearest her, so that she was almost crushed between them. But Heidi was not afraid of them, and when the lively Bearly gave rather too violent a thrust, she only said, "No, Bearly, you are pushing like the Great Turk," and Bearly immediately drew back his head, and left off his rough attentions, while Schwenli lifted her head and put on an expression as much as to say, "For no one shall ever accuse me of behaving like the Great Turk." For Schwenli was a rather more distinguished person than Bearly. And now Peter's whistle was heard, and all the goats came along, leaping and springing, and Heidi soon found herself surrounded by the whole flock, pushed this way and that by their obstreperous greetings. But at last she managed to get through them to where Schneehöppli was standing, for the young goat had in vain striven to reach her. Peter now gave a last tremendous whistle, in order to startle the goats and drive them off, for he wanted to get near himself to say something to Heidi. The goats sprang aside, and he came up to her. "Can you come out with me today?" he asked, evidently unwilling to hear her refuse. "I'm afraid I cannot, Peter," she answered. "I am expecting them every minute from Frankfort, and I must be at home when they come." "You have said the same thing for days now," grumbled Peter. "I must continue to say it till they come," replied Heidi. "How can you think, Peter, that I would be away when they came? As if I could do such a thing." "They would find uncle at home," he answered with a snarling voice. But at this moment the grandfather's stentorian voice was heard. "Why is the army not marching forward? Is it the field marshal who is missing, or some of the troops?" Whereupon Peter turned and went off, swinging his stick round so that it whistled through the air, and the goats, who understood the signal, started at full trot for their mountain pasture, Peter following in their wake. Since Heidi had been back with her grandfather, things came now and then into her mind of which she had never thought in former days. So now, with great exertion, she put her bed in order every morning, patting and stroking it till she had got it perfectly smooth and flat. Then she went about the room downstairs, put each chair back in its place, and if she found anything lying about she put it in the cupboard. After that she fetched a duster, climbed on a chair, and rubbed the table till it shone again. When the grandfather came in later, he would look round well pleased, and say to himself, "We look like Sunday every day now. Heidi did not go abroad for nothing." After Peter had departed, and she and her grandfather had breakfasted, Heidi began her daily work as usual, but she did not get on with it very fast. It was so lovely out of doors today, and every minute something happened to interrupt her in her work. Now it was a bright beam of sun shining cheerfully through the open window and seeming to say, "Come out, Heidi, come out." Heidi felt she could not stay indoors, and she ran out in answer to the call. The sunlight lay sparkling on everything around the hut, and on all the mountains and far away along the valley, and the grass slope looked so golden and inviting that she was obliged to sit down for a few minutes and look about her. Then she suddenly remembered that her stool was left standing in the middle of the floor, and that the table had not been rubbed, and she jumped up and ran inside again. But it was not long before the fir trees began their old song. Heidi felt it in all her limbs, and again the desire to run outside was irresistible, and she was off to play and leap to the tune of the waving branches. The grandfather, who was busy in his work-shed, stepped out from time to time, smiling, to watch her at these gambols. He had just gone back to his work on one of these occasions, when Heidi called out, "Grandfather, grandfather! Come, come!" He stepped quickly out, almost afraid that something had happened to the child, but he saw her running towards where the mountain path descended, crying, "They are coming! They are coming! And the doctor is in front of them!" Heidi rushed forward to welcome her old friend, who held out his hands in greeting to her. When she came up to him, she clung to his outstretched arm, and exclaimed in the joy of her heart, "Good morning, doctor, and thank you ever so many times." "God bless you, child. What have you got to thank me for?" asked the doctor, smiling. "For being at home again with grandfather," the child explained. The doctor's face brightened as if a sudden ray of sunshine had passed across it. He had not expected such a reception as this. Lost in the sense of his loneliness, he had climbed the mountain without heeding how beautiful it was on every side, and how more and more beautiful it became the higher he got. He had quite thought that Heidi would have forgotten him. She had seen so little of him, and he had felt rather like one bearing a message of disappointment, anticipating no great show of favour, coming as he did without the expected friends. But, instead, here was Heidi, her eyes dancing for joy, and full of gratitude and affection, clinging to the arm of her kind friend. He took her by the hand with fatherly tenderness. "Take me now to your grandfather, Heidi, and show me where you live." But Heidi still remained standing, looking down the path with a questioning gaze. "Where are Clara and grandmother?" she asked. "Ah, now I have to tell you something which you will be as sorry about as I am," answered the doctor. "You see, Heidi, I have come alone. Clara was very ill and could not travel, and so the grandmother stayed behind too. But next spring, when the days grow warm and long again, they are coming here for certain." Heidi was greatly concerned. She could not at first bring herself to believe that what she had for so long been picturing to herself was not going to happen after all. She stood motionless for a second or two, overcome by the unexpected disappointment. The doctor said nothing further. All around lay the silence. Only the sighing of the fir trees could be heard from where they stood. Then Heidi suddenly remembered why she had run down there, and that the doctor had really come. She lifted her eyes, and saw the sad expression in his as he looked down at her. She had never seen him with that look on his face when she was in Frankfurt. It went to Heidi's heart. She could not bear to see anybody unhappy, especially her dear doctor. No doubt it was because Clara and grandmother could not come, and so she began to think how best she might console him. "Oh, it won't be very long to wait for spring, and then they will be sure to come," she said in a reassuring voice. "Time passes very quickly with us, and then they will be able to stay longer when they are here, and Clara will be pleased at that. Now let us go and find grandfather." Hand in hand with her friend, she climbed up to the hut. She was so anxious to make the doctor happy again, that she began once more assuring him that the winter passed so quickly on the mountain that it was hardly to be taken account of, and that summer would be back again before they knew it; and she became so convinced of the truth of her own words that she called out quite cheerfully to her grandfather as they approached, "They have not come to-day, but they will be here in a very short time." The doctor was no stranger to the grandfather, for the child had talked to him so much about her friend. The old man held out his hand to his guest in friendly greeting. Then the two men sat down in front of the hut, and Heidi had her little place too, for the doctor beckoned her to come and sit beside him. The doctor told uncle how Herr Sesemann had insisted on his taking this journey, and he felt himself it would do him good, as he had not been quite the thing for a long time. Then he whispered to Heidi that there was something being brought up the mountain which had travelled with him from Frankfort, and which would give her even more pleasure than seeing the old doctor. Heidi got into a great state of excitement on hearing this, wondering what it could be. The old man urged the doctor to spend as many of the beautiful autumn days on the mountain as he could, and at least to come up whenever it was fine. He could not offer him a lodging, as he had no place to put him. He advised the doctor, however, not to go back to Ragaz, but to stay at Dorfli, where there was a clean, tidy little inn. Then the doctor could come up every morning, which would do him no end of good, and if he liked, he, the grandfather, would act as his guide to any part of the mountains he would like to see. The doctor was delighted with this proposal, and it was settled that it should be as the grandfather suggested. Meanwhile the sun had been climbing up the sky, and it was now noon. The wind had sunk, and the fir trees stood motionless. The air was still wonderfully warm and mild for that height, while a delicious freshness was mingled with the warmth of the sun. Alm uncle now rose and went indoors, returning in a few minutes with a table which he placed in front of the seat. "There, Heidi, now run in and bring us what we want for the table," he said. "The doctor must take us as he finds us. If the food is plain, he will acknowledge that the dining-room is pleasant." "I should think so indeed," replied the doctor, as he looked down over the sunlit valley. "And I accept the kind invitation. Everything must taste good up here." Heidi ran backwards and forwards as busy as a bee, and brought out everything she could find in the cupboard, for she did not know how to be pleased enough that she could help to entertain the doctor. The grandfather, meanwhile, had been preparing the meal, and now appeared with a steaming jug of milk and golden-brown toasted cheese. Then he cut some thin slices from the meat he had cured himself in the pure air, and the doctor enjoyed his dinner better than he had for a whole year past. "Our Clara must certainly come up here," he said. "It would make her quite a different person, and if she ate for any length of time, as I have to-day, she would grow plumper than anyone has ever known her before." As he spoke, a man was seen coming up the path carrying a large package on his back. When he reached the hut, he threw it on the ground and drew in 2 or 3 good breaths of the mountain air. "Ah, here's what travelled with me from Frankfort," said the doctor, rising, and he went up to the package and began undoing it, Heidi looking on in great expectation. After he had released it from its heavy outer covering, "There, child," he said, "now you can go on unpacking your treasures yourself." Heidi undid her presents one by one until they were all displayed. She could not speak the while for wonder and delight. Not till the doctor went up to her again and opened the large box to show Heidi the cakes that were for the grandmother to eat with her coffee, did she at last give a cry of joy, exclaiming, "Now grandmother will have nice things to eat!" And she wanted to pack everything up again and start at once to give them to her. But the grandfather said he should walk down with the doctor that evening, and she could go with them and take the things. Heidi now found the packet of tobacco, which she ran and gave to her grandfather. He was so pleased with it that he immediately filled his pipe with some, and the two men then sat down together again, the smoke curling up from their pipes as they talked of all kinds of things, while Heidi continued to examine first one and then another of her presents. Suddenly she ran up to them, and, standing in front of the doctor, waited till there was a pause in the conversation, and then said, "No, the other thing has not given me more pleasure than seeing you, doctor." The two men could not help laughing, and the doctor answered that he should never have thought it. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, the doctor rose, thinking it was time to return to Dorfli and seek for quarters. The grandfather carried the cakes and the shawl and the large sausage, and the doctor took Heidi's hand, so they all three started down the mountain. Arrived at Peter's home, Heidi bid the others good-bye. She was to wait at grandmother's till her grandfather, who was going on to Dorfli with his guest, returned to fetch her. As the doctor shook hands with her, she asked, "Would you like to come out with the goats tomorrow morning?" For she could think of no greater treat to offer him. "Agreed," answered the doctor. "We will go together." Heidi now ran in to the grandmother. She first, with some effort, managed to carry in the box of cakes. Then she ran out again and brought in the sausage, for her grandfather had put the presents down by the door, and then a third time for the shawl. She had placed them as close as she could to the grandmother, so that the latter might be able to feel them and understand what was there. The shawl she laid over the old woman's knees. "They are all from Frankfurt, from Clara and Grandmamma," she explained to the astonished grandmother and Brigitta, the latter having watched her dragging in all the heavy things, unable to imagine what was happening. "And you are very pleased with the cakes, aren't you, grandmother? Taste how soft they are," said Heidi over and over again, to which the grandmother continued to answer, "Yes, yes, Heidi, I should think so. What kind people they must be." And then she would pass her hand over the warm, thick shawl, and add, "This will be beautiful for the cold winter. I never thought I should have such a splendid thing as this to put on." Heidi could not help feeling some surprise at the grandmother seeming to take more pleasure in the shawl than the cakes. Meanwhile, Brigitta stood gazing at the sausage with almost an expression of awe. She had hardly in her life seen such a monster sausage, much less owned one, and she could scarcely believe her eyes. She shook her head, and said doubtfully, "I must ask uncle what it is meant for." But Heidi answered without hesitation, "It is meant for eating, not for anything else." Peter came tumbling in at this minute. "Uncle is just behind me, he is coming," he began, and then stopped short, for his eye had caught sight of the sausage, and he was too much taken aback to say more. But Heidi understood that her grandfather was near, and so said good-bye to grandmother. The old man now never passed the door without going in to wish the old woman good day, and she liked to hear his footstep approaching, for he always had a cheery word for her. But to-day it was growing late for Heidi, who was always up with the lark, and the grandfather would never let her go to bed after hours, so this evening he only called good night through the open door, and started home at once with the child, and the two climbed under the starlit sky back to their peaceful dwelling. End of chapter 16. Read by Kara Shallenberg on April 20th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 17. A Compensation. The next morning the doctor climbed up from Dorfli with Peter and the goats. The kindly gentleman tried now and then to enter into conversation with the boy, but his attempts failed, for he could hardly get a word out of Peter in answer to his questions. Peter was not easily persuaded to talk. So the party silently made their way up to the hut, where they found Heidi awaiting them with her 2 goats, all 3 as fresh and lively as the morning sun among the mountains. "Are you coming today?" said Peter, repeating the words with which he daily greeted her, either in question or in summons. "Of course I am, if the doctor is coming too," replied Heidi. Peter cast a sidelong glance at the doctor. The grandfather now came out with the dinner bag, and after bidding good day to the doctor, he went up to Peter and slung it over his neck. It was heavier than usual, for Uncle had added some meat today, as he thought the doctor might like to have his lunch out and eat it when the children did. Peter gave a grin, for he felt sure there was something more than ordinary in it. And so the ascent began. The goats, as usual, came thronging around Heidi, each trying to be nearest her, until at last she stood still and said, "Now you must go on in front and behave properly, and not keep on turning back and pushing and poking me, for I want to talk to the doctor." And she gave Schneehöppli a little pat on the back, and told her to be good and obedient. By degrees she managed to make her way out from among them and joined the doctor, who took her by the hand. He had no difficulty now in conversing with his companion, for Heidi had a great deal to say about the goats and their peculiarities, and about the flowers and the rocks and the birds, and so they clambered on and reached their resting place before they were aware. Peter had sent a good many unfriendly glances towards the doctor on the way up, which might have quite alarmed the latter if he had happened to notice them, which, fortunately, he did not. Heidi now led her friend to her favorite spot where she was accustomed to sit and enjoy the beauty around her. The doctor followed her example and took his seat beside her on the warm grass. Over the heights and over the far green valley hung the golden glory of the autumn day. The great snow-field sparkled in the bright sunlight, and the 2 gray, rocky peaks rose in their ancient majesty against the dark blue sky. A soft, light morning breeze blew deliciously across the mountain, gently stirring the bluebells that still remained of the summer's wealth of flowers, their slender heads nodding cheerfully in the sunshine. Overhead the great bird was flying round and round in wide circles, but today he made no sound. Poised on his large wings, he floated contentedly in the blue ether. Heidi looked about her, first at one thing and then at another. The waving flowers, the blue sky, the bright sunshine, the happy bird, everything was so beautiful, so beautiful. Her eyes were alight with joy. And now she turned to her friend to see if he too were enjoying the beauty. The doctor had been sitting thoughtfully gazing around him. As he met her glad, bright eyes, "Yes, Heidi," he responded, "I see how lovely it all is, but tell me, if one brings a sad heart up here, how may it be healed so that it can rejoice in all this beauty?" "Oh, but," exclaimed Heidi, "no one is sad up here, only in Frankfurt." The doctor smiled, and then growing serious again, he continued, "But supposing one is not able to leave all the sadness behind at Frankfurt, can you tell me anything that will help then?" "When you do not know what more to do, you must go and tell everything to God," answered Heidi with decision. "Ah, that is a good thought of yours, Heidi," said the doctor. "But if it is God himself who has sent the trouble, what can we say to him then?" Heidi sat pondering for a while. She was sure in her heart that God could help out of every trouble. She thought over her own experiences, and then found her answer. "Then you must wait," she said, "and keep on saying to yourself, 'God certainly knows of some happiness for us which he is going to bring out of the trouble, only we must have patience and not run away.' And then all at once something happens, and we see clearly ourselves that God has had some good thought in his mind all along, but because we cannot see things beforehand, and only know how dreadfully miserable we are, We think it is always going to be so." "That is a beautiful faith, child, and be sure you hold it fast," replied the doctor. Then he sat on a while in silence, looking at the great overshadowing mountains and the green sunlit valley below, before he spoke again. "Can you understand, Heidi, that a man may sit here with such a shadow over his eyes that he cannot feel and enjoy the beauty around him, while the heart grows doubly sad, knowing how beautiful it could be? Can you understand that?" A pain shot through the child's young, happy heart. The shadow over the eyes brought to her remembrance the grandmother, who would never again be able to see the sunlight and the beauty up here. This was Heidi's great sorrow, which reawoke each time she thought about the darkness. She did not speak for a few minutes, for her happiness was interrupted by this sudden pang. Then, in a grave voice, she said, "Yes, I can understand it, and I know this, that then one must say one of grandmother's hymns, which bring the light back a little, and often make it so bright for her that she is quite happy again. Grandmother herself told me this." "Which hymns are they, Heidi?" asked the doctor. "I only know the one about the sun and the beautiful garden, and some of the verses of the long one, which are favorites with her, and she always likes me to read them to her 2 or 3 times over," replied Heidi. "Well, say the verses to me, then. I should like to hear them too." And the doctor sat up in order to listen better. Heidi put her hands together and sat collecting her thoughts for a second or two. "Shall I begin at the verse that grandmother says gives her a feeling of hope and confidence?" The doctor nodded his assent, and Heidi began. "Let not your heart be troubled, nor fear your soul dismay. There is a wise defender, and he will be your stay. Where you have failed, he conquers. See how the foeman flies, and all your tribulation is turned to glad surprise. If for a while it seemeth his mercy is withdrawn, that he no longer careth for his wandering child forlorn, doubt not his great compassion, his love can never tire. To those who wait in patience, he gives their heart's desire." Heidi suddenly paused. She was not sure if the doctor was still listening. He was sitting motionless with his hand before his eyes. She thought he had fallen asleep. When he awoke, if he wanted to hear more verses, she would go on. There was no sound anywhere. The doctor sat in silence, but he was certainly not asleep. His thoughts had carried him back to a long past time. He saw himself as a little boy, standing by his dear mother's chair. She had her arm round his neck, and was saying the very verses to him that Heidi had just recited, words which he had not heard now for years. He could hear his mother's voice and see her loving eyes resting upon him, and as Heidi ceased, the old dear voice seemed to be saying other things to him, and the words he heard again must have carried him far, far away, for it was a long time before he stirred or took his hand from his eyes. When at last he roused himself, he met Heidi's eyes looking wonderingly at him. "Heidi," he said, taking the child's hand in his, "that was a beautiful hymn of yours." And there was a happier ring in his voice as he spoke. "We will come out here together another day, and you will let me hear it again." Peter, meanwhile, had had enough to do in giving vent to his anger. It was now some days since Heidi had been out with him, and when at last she did come, there she sat the whole time beside the old gentleman, and Peter could not get a word with her. He got into a terrible temper, and at last went and stood some way back behind the doctor, where the latter could not see him, and doubling his fist made imaginary hits at the enemy. Presently he doubled both fists, and the longer Heidi stayed beside the gentleman, the more fiercely did he threaten with them. Meanwhile the sun had risen to the height which Peter knew pointed to the dinner hour. All of a sudden he called at the top of his voice, "It's dinner time!" Heidi was rising to fetch the dinner-bag so that the doctor might eat his where he sat, but he stopped her, telling her he was not hungry at all, and only cared for a glass of milk, as he wanted to climb up a little higher. Then Heidi found that she also was not hungry, and only wanted milk, and she should like, she said, to take the doctor up to the large moss-covered rock where Distelfink had nearly jumped down and killed herself. So she ran and explained matters to Peter, telling him to go and get milk for the two. Peter seemed hardly to understand. "Who is going to eat what is in the bag, then?" he asked. "You can have it," she answered. "Only first make haste and get the milk." Peter had seldom performed any task more promptly, for he thought of the bag and its contents, which now belonged to him. As soon as the other two were sitting quietly drinking their milk, he opened it, and quite trembled for joy at the sight of the meat, and he was just putting his hand in to draw it out when something seemed to hold him back. His conscience smote him at the remembrance of how he had stood with his doubled fists behind the doctor, who was now giving up to him his whole good dinner. He felt as if he could not now enjoy it. But all at once he jumped up and ran back to the spot where he had stood before, and there held up his open hands as a sign that he had no longer any wish to use them as fists, and kept them up until he felt he had made amends for his past conduct. Then he rushed back and sat down to the double enjoyment of a clear conscience and an unusually satisfying meal. Heidi and the doctor climbed and talked for a long while, until the latter said it was time for him to be going back, and no doubt Heidi would like to go and be with her goats. But Heidi would not hear of this, as then the doctor would have to go the whole way down the mountain alone. She insisted on accompanying him as far as the grandfather's hut, or even a little further. She kept hold of her friend's hand all the time, and the whole way she entertained him with accounts of this thing and that, showing him the spots where the goats loved best to feed, and others where in summer the flowers of all colors grew in greatest abundance. She could give them all their right names, for her grandfather had taught her these during the summer months. But at last the doctor insisted on her going back, so they bid each other good night, and the doctor continued his descent, turning now and again to look back, and each time he saw Heidi standing on the same spot and waving her hand to him. Even so in the old days had his own dear little daughter watched him when he went from home. It was a bright, sunny autumn month. The doctor came up to the hut every morning, and thence made excursions over the mountain. Alm Uncle accompanied him on some of his higher ascents, when they climbed up to the ancient storm-beaten fir-trees, and often disturbed the great bird which rose startled from its nest, with the whirl of wings and croakings very near their heads. The doctor found great pleasure in his companion's conversation, and was astonished at his knowledge of the plants that grew on the mountain. He knew the uses of them all, from the aromatic fir-trees and the dark pines with their scented needles, to the curly moss that sprang up everywhere about the roots of the trees, and also the smallest plant and tiniest flower. He was as well versed also in the ways of the animals, great and small, and had many amusing anecdotes to tell of these dwellers in caves and holes and in the tops of the fir-trees. And so the time passed pleasantly and quickly for the doctor, who seldom said good-bye to the old man at the end of the day without adding, "I never leave you, friend, without having learnt something new from you." On some of the very finest days, however, the doctor would wander out again with Heidi, and then the two would sit together as on the first day, and the child would repeat her hymns and tell the doctor things which she alone knew. Peter sat at a little distance from them, but he was now quite reconciled in spirit, and gave vent to no angry pantomime. September had drawn to its close, and now one morning the doctor appeared looking less cheerful than usual. It was his last day, he said, as he must return to Frankfurt, but he was grieved at having to say good-bye to the mountain, which had begun to feel quite like home. Alm uncle, on his side, greatly regretted the departure of his guest, and Heidi had been now accustomed for so long to see her good friend every day, that she could hardly believe the time had suddenly come to separate. She looked up at him in doubt, taken by surprise, but there was no help. He must go. So he bid farewell to the old man, and asked that Heidi might go with him part of the return way, and Heidi took his hand and went down the mountain with him, still unable to grasp the idea that he was going for good. After some distance the doctor stood still, and passing his hand over the child's curly head, said, "Now, Heidi, you must go back, and I must say good-bye. If only I could take you with me to Frankfurt and keep you there." The picture of Frankfurt rose before the child's eyes, its rows of endless houses, its hard streets, and even the vision of Fräulein Rottenmeier and Tinette, and she answered hesitatingly, "I would rather that you came back to us." "Yes, you are right, that would be better. But now good-bye, Heidi." The child put her hand in his, and looked up at him. The kind eyes looking down on her had tears in them. Then the doctor tore himself away, and quickly continued his descent. Heidi remained standing without moving. The friendly eyes with the tears in them had gone to her heart. All at once she burst into tears, and started running as fast as she could after the departing figure, calling out in broken tones, "Doctor! Doctor!" He turned round, and waited till the child reached him. The tears were streaming down her face, and she sobbed out, "I will come to Frankfurt with you, now at once, and I will stay with you as long as you like, only I must just run back and tell grandfather." The doctor laid his hand on her, and tried to calm her excitement. "No, no, dear child," he said kindly. "Not now. You must stay for the present under the fir-trees, or I should have you ill again. But hear now what I have to ask you. If I am ever ill and alone, will you come then and stay with me? May I know that there would then be some one to look after me and care for me?" "Yes, yes, I will come the very day you send for me, and I love you nearly as much as grandfather," replied Heidi, who had not yet got over her distress. And so the doctor again bid her good-bye, and started on his way, while Heidi remained looking after him, and waving her hand as long as a speck of him could be seen. As the doctor turned for the last time, and looked back at the waving Heidi and the sunny mountain, he said to himself, "It is good to be up there, good for body and soul, and a man might learn how to be happy once more." End of chapter 17. Read by Kara Shallenberg on April 24th, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 18. Winter in Dorfli. The snow was lying so high around the hut that the windows looked level with the ground, and the door had entirely disappeared from view. If Alm uncle had been up there, he would have had to do what Peter did daily, for fresh snow fell every night. Peter had to get out of the window of the sitting-room every morning, and if the frost had not been very hard during the night, he immediately sank up to his shoulders almost in the snow, and had to struggle with hands, feet, and head to extricate himself. Then his mother handed him the large broom, and with this he worked hard to make a way to the door. He had to be careful to dig the snow well away, or else as soon as the door was opened, the whole soft mass would fall inside, or, if the frost was severe enough, it would have made such a wall of ice in front of the house that no one could have gone in or out, for the window was only big enough for Peter to creep through. The fresh snow froze like this in the night sometimes, and this was an enjoyable time for Peter, for he would get through the window on to the hard, smooth, frozen ground, and his mother would hand him out the little sleigh, and he could then make his descent to Dorfli along any route he chose, for the whole mountain was nothing but one wide, unbroken sleigh-road. Alm uncle had kept his word, and was not spending the winter in his old home. As soon as the first snow began to fall, he had shut up the hut and the outside buildings, and gone down to Dorfli with Heidi and the goats. Near the church was a straggling, half-ruined building, which had once been the house of a person of consequence. A distinguished soldier had lived there at one time. He had taken service in Spain, and had there performed many brave deeds and gathered much treasure. When he returned home to Dorfli, he spent part of his booty in building a fine house, with the intention of living in it. But he had been too long accustomed to the noise and bustle of arms and the world to care for a quiet country life, and he soon went off again, and this time did not return. When, after many long years, it seemed certain that he was dead, a distant relative took possession of the house, but it had already fallen into disrepair, and he had no wish to rebuild it. So it was let to poor people, who paid but a small rent, and when any part of the building fell, it was allowed to remain. This had now gone on for many years. As long ago as when his son Tobias was a child, Alm Uncle had rented the tumble-down old place. Since then it had stood empty, for no one could stay in it who had not some idea of how to stop up the holes and gaps and make it habitable. Otherwise the wind and rain and snow blew into the rooms, so that it was impossible even to keep a candle alight, and the dwellers would have been frozen to death during the long cold winters. Alm Uncle, however, knew how to mend matters. As soon as he made up his mind to spend the winter in Dorfli, he rented the old place, and worked during the autumn to get it sound and tight. In the middle of October he and Heidi took up their residence there. On approaching the house from the back, one came first into an open space with a wall on either side, of which one was half in ruins. Above this rose the arch of an old window thickly overgrown with ivy, which spread over the remains of a domed roof that had evidently been part of a chapel. A large hall came next, which lay open, without doors, to the square outside. Here also walls and roof only partially remained, and indeed what was left of the roof looked as if it might fall at any minute, had it not been for two stout pillars that supported it. Alm Uncle had here put up a wooden partition, and covered the floor with straw, for this was to be the goat's house. Endless passages led from this, through the rents of which the sky as well as the fields and the road outside could be seen at intervals, but at last one came to a stout oak door that led into a room that still stood intact. Here the walls and the dark wainscoting remained as good as ever, and in the corner was an immense stove reaching nearly to the ceiling, on the white tiles of which were painted large pictures in blue. These represented old castles surrounded with trees, and huntsmen riding out with their hounds, or else a quiet lake scene with broad oak trees and a man fishing. A seat ran all round the stove, so that one could sit at one's ease and study the pictures. These attracted Heidi's attention at once, and she had no sooner arrived with her grandfather than she ran and seated herself and began to examine them. But when she had gradually worked herself round to the back, something else diverted her attention. In the large space between the stove and the wall 4 planks had been put together, as if to make a large receptacle for apples. There were no apples, however, inside, but something Heidi had no difficulty in recognizing, for it was her very own bed, with its hay mattress and sheets, and sack for a coverlet, just as she had it up at the hut. Heidi clapped her hands for joy, and exclaimed, "Oh, grandfather, this is my room, how nice! But where are you going to sleep?" "Your room must be near the stove, or you will freeze," he replied, "but you can come and see mine too." Heidi got down and skipped across the large room after her grandfather, who opened a door at the farther end leading into a smaller one, which was to be his bedroom. Then came another door. Heidi pushed it open and stood amazed, for here was an immense room like a kitchen, larger than anything of the kind that Heidi had seen before. There was still plenty of work for the grandfather before this room could be finished, for there were holes and cracks in the walls through which the wind whistled, and yet he had already nailed up so many new planks that it looked as if a lot of small cupboards had been set up round the room. He had, however, made the large old door safe with many screws and nails, as a protection against the outside air, and this was very necessary, for just beyond was a mass of ruined buildings overgrown with tall weeds, which made a dwelling-place for endless beetles and lizards. Heidi was very delighted with her new home, and by the morning after their arrival she knew every nook and corner so thoroughly that she could take Peter over it and show him all that was to be seen. Indeed, she would not let him go till he had examined every single wonderful thing contained in it. Heidi slept soundly in her corner by the stove, but every morning when she first awoke she still thought she was on the mountain, and that she must run outside at once to see if the fir-trees were so quiet because their branches were weighed down with the thick snow. She had to look about her for some minutes before she felt quite sure where she was, and a certain sensation of trouble and oppression would come over her as she grew aware that she was not at home in the hut. But then she would hear her grandfather's voice outside, attending to the goats, and these would give one or two loud bleats, as if calling to her to make haste and go to them, and then Heidi was happy again, for she knew she was still at home, and she would jump gladly out of bed and run to the animals as quickly as she could. On the fourth morning, as soon as she saw her grandfather, she said, "I must go up and see grandmother to-day. She ought not to be alone so long." But the grandfather would not agree to this. "Neither to-day nor to-morrow can you go," he said. "The mountain is covered fathom deep in snow, and the snow is still falling. The sturdy Peter can hardly get along. A little creature like you would soon be smothered by it, and we should not be able to find you again. Wait a bit till it freezes. Then you will be able to walk over the hard snow." Heidi did not like the thought of having to wait, but the days were so busy that she hardly knew how they went by. Heidi now went to school in Dorfli every morning and afternoon, and eagerly set to work to learn all that was taught her. She hardly ever saw Peter there, for as a rule he was absent. The teacher was an easy-going man who merely remarked now and then, "Peter is not turning up to-day again, it seems, but there is a lot of snow up on the mountain, and I dare say he cannot get along." Peter, however, always seemed able to make his way through the snow in the evening when school was over, and he then generally paid Heidi a visit. At last, after some days, the sun again appeared, and shone brightly over the white ground, but he went to bed again behind the mountains at a very early hour, as if he did not find such pleasure in looking down on the earth as when everything was green and flowery. But then the moon came out clear and large, and lit up the great white snow-field all through the night, and the next morning the whole mountain glistened and sparkled like a huge crystal. When Peter got out of his window as usual, he was taken by surprise, for instead of sinking into the soft snow, he fell on the hard ground, and went sliding some way down the mountain-side like a sleigh before he could stop himself. He picked himself up, and tested the hardness of the ground by stamping on it, and trying with all his might to dig his heels into it, but even then he could not break off a single little splinter of ice. The alm was frozen hard as iron. This was just what Peter had been hoping for, as he knew now that Heidi would be able to come up to them. He quickly got back into the house, swallowed the milk which his mother had put ready for him, thrust a piece of bread in his pocket, and said, "I must be off to school." "That's right, go and learn all you can," said the grandmother encouragingly. Peter crept through the window again. The door was quite blocked by the frozen snow outside, pulling his little sleigh after him, and in another minute was shooting down the mountain. He went like lightning, and when he reached Dorfli, which stood on the direct road to Mayenfeld, he made up his mind to go on further, for he was sure he could not stop his rapid descent without hurting himself and the sleigh too. So down he still went till he reached the level ground, where the sleigh came to a pause of its own accord. Then he got out and looked round. The impetus with which he had made his journey down had carried him some little way beyond Mayenfeld. He bethought himself that it was too late to get to school now, as lessons would already have begun, and it would take him a good hour to walk back to Dorfli. So he might take his time about returning, which he did, and reached Dorfli just as Heidi had got home from school, and was sitting at dinner with her grandfather. Peter walked in, and as on this occasion he had something particular to communicate, he began without a pause, exclaiming as he stood still in the middle of the room, "She's got it now." "Got it? What?" asked the uncle. "Your words sound quite warlike, General." "The frost," explained Peter. "Oh, then now I can go and see grandmother," said Heidi joyfully, for she had understood Peter's words at once. "But why were you not at school, then? You could have come down in the sleigh," she added reproachfully, for it did not agree with Heidi's ideas of good behavior to stay away, when it was possible to be there. "It carried me on too far, and I was too late," Peter replied. "I call that being a deserter," said the uncle, "and deserters get their ears pulled, as you know." Peter gave a tug to his cap in alarm, for there was no one of whom he stood in so much awe as Alm Uncle. "And an army leader like yourself ought to be doubly ashamed of running away," continued Alm Uncle. "What would you think of your goats if one went off this way and another that, and refused to follow and do what was good for them? What would you do then?" "I should beat them," said Peter promptly. "And if a boy behaved like these unruly goats, and he got a beating for it, what would you say then?" "Serve him right," was the answer. "Good. Then understand this. Next time you let your sleigh carry you past the school when you ought to be inside at your lessons, come on to me afterwards, and receive what you deserve." Peter now understood the drift of the old man's questions, and that he was the boy who behaved like the unruly goats, and he looked somewhat fearfully towards the corner to see if anything happened to be there such as he used himself on such occasions for the punishment of his animals. But now the grandfather suddenly said in a cheerful voice, "Come and sit down and have something, and afterwards Heidi shall go with you. Bring her back this evening, and you will find supper waiting for you here." This unexpected turn of conversation set Peter grinning all over with delight. He obeyed without hesitation and took his seat beside Heidi. But the child could not eat any more in her excitement at the thought of going to see grandmother. She pushed the potatoes and toasted cheese, which still stood on her plate, towards him, while Uncle was filling his plate from the other side, so that he had quite a large pile of food in front of him, but he attacked it without any lack of courage. Heidi ran to the cupboard and brought out the warm cloak Clara had sent her. With this on, and the hood drawn over her head, she was all ready for her journey. She stood waiting beside Peter, and as soon as his last mouthful had disappeared, she said, "Come along now." As the two walked together, Heidi had much to tell Peter of her two goats that had been so unhappy the first day in their new stall that they would not eat anything, but stood hanging their heads, not even rousing themselves to bleat. And when she asked her grandfather the reason of this, he told her it was with them as with her in Frankfurt, for it was the first time in their lives they had come down from the mountain. "And you don't know what that is, Peter, unless you have felt it yourself," added Heidi. The children had nearly reached their destination before Peter opened his mouth. He appeared to be so sunk in thought that he hardly heard what was said to him. As they neared home, however, he stood still, and said in a somewhat sullen voice, "I had rather go to school even than get what Uncle threatened." Heidi was of the same mind, and encouraged him in his good intention. They found Brigitte sitting alone knitting, for the grandmother was not very well, and had to stay the day in bed on account of the cold. Heidi had never before missed the old figure in her place in the corner, and she ran quickly into the next room. There lay grandmother on her little poorly covered bed, wrapped up in her warm grey shawl. "Thank God!" she exclaimed as Heidi came running in. The poor old woman had had a secret fear at heart all through the autumn, especially if Heidi was absent for any length of time, for Peter had told her of a strange gentleman who had come from Frankfurt, and who had gone out with them and always talked to Heidi, and she felt sure he had come to take her away again. Even when she heard he had gone off alone, she still had an idea that a messenger would be sent over from Frankfurt to fetch the child. Heidi went up to the side of the bed and said, "Are you very ill, grandmother?" "No, no, child," answered the old woman reassuringly, passing her hand lovingly over the child's head. "It's only the frost that has got into my bones a bit." "Shall you be quite well, then, directly it turns warm again?" "Yes, God willing, or even before that, for I want to get back to my spinning. I thought perhaps I should do a little to-day, but to-morrow I am sure to be all right again." The old woman had detected that Heidi was frightened, and was anxious to set her mind at ease. Her words comforted Heidi, who had in truth been greatly distressed, for she had never before seen the grandmother ill in bed. She now looked at the old woman seriously for a minute or two, and then said, "In Frankfurt everybody puts on a shawl to go out walking. Did you think it was to be worn in bed, grandmother?" "I put it on, dear child, to keep myself from freezing, and I am so pleased with it, for my bedclothes are not very thick," she answered. "But, grandmother," continued Heidi, "your bed is not right, because it goes downhill at your head instead of uphill." "I know it, child, I can feel it," and the grandmother put up her hand to the thin flat pillow, which was little more than a board under her head, to make herself more comfortable. "The pillow was never very thick, and I have lain on it now for so many years that it has grown quite flat." "Oh, if only I had asked Clara to let me take away my Frankfurt bed," said Heidi. "I had 3 large pillows, one above the other, so that I could hardly sleep, and I used to slip down to try and find a flat place, and then I had to pull myself up again, because it was proper to sleep there like that. Could you sleep like that, grandmother?" "Oh, yes, the pillows keep one warm, and it is easier to breathe when the head is high," answered the grandmother, wearily raising her head as she spoke, as if trying to find a higher resting place. "But we will not talk about that, for I have so much that other old sick people are without, for which I thank God. There is the nice bread I get every day, and this warm wrap, and your visits, Heidi. Will you read me something to-day?" Heidi ran into the next room to fetch the hymn-book. Then she picked out the favorite hymns one after another, for she knew them all by heart now, as pleased as the grandmother to hear them again after so many days. The grandmother lay with folded hands, while a smile of peace stole over the worn, troubled face, like one to whom good news has been brought. Suddenly Heidi paused. "Grandmother, are you feeling quite well again already?" "Yes, child, I have grown better while listening to you. Read it to the end." The child read on, and when she came to the last words, "As the eyes grow dim and darkness closes round, the soul grows clearer, sees the goal to which it travels, gladly feels its home is nearer." The grandmother repeated them once or twice to herself, with a look of happy expectation on her face. And Heidi took equal pleasure in them, for the picture of the beautiful sunny day of her return home rose before her eyes, and she exclaimed joyfully, "Grandmother, I know exactly what it is like to go home." The old woman did not answer, but she had heard Heidi's words, and the expression that had made the child think she was better remained on her face. A little later Heidi said, "It is growing dark, and I must go home. I am glad to think that you are quite well again." The grandmother took the child's hand in hers and held it closely. "Yes," she said, "I feel quite happy again. Even if I have to go on lying here, I am content. No one knows what it is to lie here alone day after day, in silence and darkness, without hearing a voice or seeing a ray of light. Sad thoughts come over me, and I do not feel sometimes as if I could bear it any longer, or as if it could ever be light again. But when you come and read those words to me, then I am comforted, and my heart rejoices once more." Then she let the child go, and Heidi ran into the next room, and bid Peter come quickly, for it had now grown quite dark. But when they got outside, they found the moon shining down on the white snow, and everything as clear as in the daylight. Peter got his sleigh, put Heidi at the back, he himself sitting in front to guide, and down the mountain they shot like two birds darting through the air. When Heidi was lying that night on her high bed of hay, she thought of the grandmother on her low pillow, and of all she had said about the light and comfort that awoke in her when she heard the hymns, and she thought, "If I could read to her every day, then I should go on making her better." But she knew that it would be a week, if not 2, before she would be able to go up the mountain again. This was a thought of great trouble to Heidi, and she tried hard to think of some way which would enable the grandmother to hear the words she loved every day. Suddenly an idea struck her, and she was so delighted with it that she could hardly bear to wait for morning, so eager was she to begin carrying out her plan. All at once she sat upright in her bed, for she had been so busy with her thoughts that she had forgotten to say her prayers, and she never now finished her day without saying them. When she had prayed with all her heart for herself, her grandfather and grandmother, she lay back on the warm, soft hay, and slept soundly and peacefully till morning broke. End of chapter 18. Read by Kara Shallenberg on April 26, 2006, in Oceanside, California. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 19. The Winter Continues. Peter arrived punctually at school the following day. He had brought his dinner with him, for all the children who lived at a distance regularly seated themselves at midday on the tables, and resting their feet firmly on the benches, spread out their meal on their knees, and so ate their dinner, while those living in Dorfli went home for theirs. Till 1 o'clock they might all do as they liked, and then school began again. When Peter had finished his lessons on the days he attended school, he went over to Uncle's to see Heidi. When he walked into the large room at Uncle's today, Heidi immediately rushed forward and took hold of him, for it was for Peter she had been waiting. "I've thought of something, Peter," she said hastily. "What is it?" he asked. "You must learn to read," she informed him. "I have learnt," was the answer. Yes, but I mean so that you can really make use of it," continued Heidi eagerly. "I never shall," was the prompt reply. "Nobody believes that you cannot learn, nor I either now," said Heidi in a very decided tone of voice. "Grandmamma in Frankfurt said long ago that it was not true, and she told me not to believe you." Peter looked rather taken aback at this piece of intelligence. "I will soon teach you to read, for I know how," continued Heidi. "You must learn at once, and then you can read 1 or 2 hymns every day to grandmother." "Oh, I don't care about that," he grumbled in reply. This hard-hearted way of refusing to agree to what was right and kind, and to what Heidi had so much at heart, aroused her anger. With flashing eyes she stood facing the boy and said threateningly, "If you won't learn as I want you to, I will tell you what will happen. You know your mother has often spoken of sending you to Frankfurt, that you may learn a lot of things. And I know where the boys there have to go to school. Clara pointed out the great house to me when we were driving together. And they don't only go when they are boys, but have more lessons still when they are grown men. I have seen them myself, and you mustn't think they have only one kind teacher like we have. There are ever so many of them, all in the school at the same time, and they are all dressed in black, as if they were going to church, and have black hats on their heads as high as that." And Heidi held out her hand to show their height from the floor. Peter felt a cold shudder run down his back. "And you will have to go in among all those gentlemen," continued Heidi with increasing animation. "And when it comes to your turn you won't be able to read, and will make mistakes in your spelling. Then you'll see how they'll make fun of you, even worse than Tinette, and you ought to have seen what she was like when she was scornful." "Well, I'll learn then," said Peter, half sorrowfully and half angrily. Heidi was instantly mollified. "That's right. Then we'll begin at once," she said cheerfully, and went busily to work on the spot, dragging Peter to the table and fetching her books. Among other presents, Clara had sent Heidi a book, which the latter had decided, in bed the night before, would serve capitally for teaching Peter, for it was an ABC book with rhyming lines. And now the two sat together at the table with their heads bent over the book, for the lesson had begun. Peter was made to spell out the first sentence 2 or 3 times over, for Heidi wished him to get it correct and fluent. At last she said, "You don't seem able to get it right, but I will read it aloud to you once. When you know what it ought to be, you will find it easier." And she read out, "ABC must be learnt today, or the judge will call you up to pay." "I shan't go," said Peter obstinately. "Go where?" asked Heidi. "Before the judge," he answered. "Well, then make haste and learn these 3 letters. Then you won't have to go." Peter went at his task again, and repeated the 3 letters so many times and with such determination, that she said at last, "You must know those 3 now." Seeing what an effect the first 2 lines of verse had had upon him, she thought she would prepare the ground a little for the following lessons. "Wait, and I will read you some of the next sentences," she continued. "Then you will see what else there is to expect." And she began in a clear, slow voice. "D, E, F, G must run with ease, or something will follow that does not please. Should H, I, J, K be now forgot, disgrace is yours upon the spot. And then L, M must follow at once, or punished you'll be for a sorry dunce. If you knew what next awaited you, you'd haste to learn N-O-P-Q. Now R-S-T be quick about, or worse will follow, there's little doubt." Heidi paused, for Peter was so quiet that she looked to see what he was doing. These many secret threats and hints of dreadful punishments had so affected him that he sat as if petrified, and stared at Heidi with horror-stricken eyes. Her kind heart was moved at once, and she said, wishing to reassure him, "You need not be afraid, Peter. Come here to me every evening, and if you learn as you have to-day, you will at last know all your letters, and the other things won't come. But you must come regularly, not now and then as you do to school. Even if it snows, it won't hurt you." Peter promised, for the trepidation he had been in had made him quite tame and docile. Lessons being finished for this day, he now went home. Peter obeyed Heidi's instructions punctually, and every evening went diligently to work to learn the following letters, taking the sentences thoroughly to heart. The grandfather was frequently in the room smoking his pipe comfortably while the lesson was going on, and his face twitched occasionally as if he was overtaken with a sudden fit of merriment. Peter was often invited to stay to supper after the great exertion he had gone through, which richly compensated him for the anguish of mind he had suffered with the sentence for the day. So the winter went by, and Peter really made progress with his letters, but he went through a terrible fight each day with the sentences. He had got at last to U. Heidi read out, "And if you put the U for V, you'll go where you would not like to be." Peter growled, "Yes, but I shan't go." But he was very diligent that day, as if under the impression that some one would seize him suddenly by the collar and drag him where he would rather not go. The next evening Heidi read, If you falter at W, worst of all, look at the stick against the wall." Peter looked at the wall and said scornfully, "There isn't one." "Yes, but do you know what grandfather has in his box?" asked Heidi. "A stick as thick almost as your arm, and if he took that out, you might well say, 'Look at the stick on the wall.'" Peter knew that thick hazel stick, and immediately bent his head over the W and struggled to master it. Another day the lines ran, "Then comes the X for you to say, or be sure you'll get no food today." Peter looked towards the cupboard where the bread and cheese were kept, and said crossly, "I never said that I should forget the X." "That's all right. If you don't forget it, we can go on to learn the next, and then you will only have one more," replied Heidi, anxious to encourage him. Peter did not quite understand, but when Heidi went on and read, "And should you make a stop at Y, they'll point at you and cry, 'Fie, fie!' All the gentlemen in Frankfurt, with tall black hats on their heads, and scorn and mockery in their faces, rose up before his mind's eye, and he threw himself with energy on the Y, not letting it go till at last he knew it so thoroughly that he could see what it was like even when he shut his eyes. He arrived on the following day in a somewhat lofty frame of mind, for there was now only one letter to struggle over, and when Heidi began the lesson with reading aloud, "Make haste with Z, if you're too slow, off to the Hottentots you'll go," Peter remarked scornfully, "I dare say, when no one knows even where such people live." "I assure you, Peter," replied Heidi, "grandfather knows all about them. Wait a second, and I will run and ask him, for he is only over the way with the pastor." And she rose and ran to the door to put her words into action, but Peter cried out in a voice of agony, "Stop!" for he already saw himself being carried off by Alm uncle and the pastor, and sent straight away to the Hottentots, since as yet he did not know his last letter. His cry of fear brought Heidi back. "What's the matter?" she asked in astonishment. "Nothing. Come back. I am going to learn my letter," he said, stammering with fear. Heidi, however, herself wished to know where the Hottentots lived, and persisted that she should ask her grandfather, but she gave in at last to Peter's despairing entreaties. She insisted on his doing something in return, and so not only had he to repeat his Z until it was so fixed in his memory that he could never forget it again, but she began teaching him to spell, and Peter really made a good start that evening. So it went on from day to day. The frost had gone, and the snow was soft again, and moreover fresh snow continually fell, so that it was quite 3 weeks before Heidi could go to the grandmother again. So much the more eagerly did she pursue her teaching, so that Peter might compensate for her absence by reading hymns to the old woman. One evening he walked in home after leaving Heidi, and as he entered he said, "I can do it now." "Do what, Peter?" asked his mother. "Read," he answered. "Do you really mean it? Did you hear that, grandmother?" she called out. The grandmother had heard, and was already wondering how such a thing could have come to pass. "I must read one of the hymns now. Heidi told me to," he went on to inform them. His mother hastily fetched the book, and the grandmother lay in joyful expectation, for it was so long since she had heard the good words. Peter sat down to the table and began to read. His mother sat beside him, listening with surprise, and exclaiming at the close of each verse, "Who would have thought it possible?" The grandmother did not speak, though she followed the words he read with strained attention. It happened on the day following this that there was a reading lesson in Peter's class. When it came to his turn, the teacher said, "We must pass over Peter as usual, or will you try again once more? I will not say to read, but to stammer through a sentence." Peter took the book and read off 3 lines without the slightest hesitation. The teacher put down his book and stared at Peter as at some out-of-the-way and marvelous thing unseen before. At last he spoke. "Peter, some miracle has been performed upon you. Here have I been striving with unheard-of patience to teach you, and you have not hitherto been able to say your letters even. And now, just as I had made up my mind not to waste any more trouble upon you, you suddenly are able to read a consecutive sentence properly and distinctly. How has such a miracle come to pass in our days?" "It was Heidi," answered Peter. The teacher looked in astonishment towards Heidi, who was sitting innocently on her bench, with no appearance of anything supernatural about her. He continued, "I have noticed a change in you altogether, Peter. Whereas formerly you often missed coming to school for a week, or even weeks at a time, you have lately not stayed away a single day. Who has wrought this change for good in you?" "It was uncle," answered Peter. With increasing surprise the teacher looked from Peter to Heidi, and back again at Peter. "We will try once more," he said cautiously, and Peter had again to show off his accomplishment by reading another 3 lines. There was no mistake about it. Peter could read. As soon as school was over, the teacher went over to the pastor to tell him this piece of news, and to inform him of the happy result of Heidi's and the grandfather's combined efforts. Every evening Peter read 1 hymn aloud. So far he obeyed Heidi. Nothing would induce him to read a second, and indeed the grandmother never asked for it. His mother Brigitte could not get over her surprise at her son's attainment, and when the reader was in bed would often express her pleasure at it. "Now he has learnt to read, there is no knowing what may be made of him yet." On one of these occasions the grandmother answered, "Yes, it is good for him to have learnt something, but I shall indeed be thankful when spring is here again, and Heidi can come. They are not like the same hymns when Peter reads them. So many words seem missing, and I try to think what they ought to be, and then I lose the sense, and so the hymns do not come home to my heart as when Heidi reads them." The truth was that Peter arranged to make his reading as little troublesome for himself as possible. When he came upon a word that he thought was too long or difficult in any other way, he left it out, for he decided that a word or 2 less in a verse, when there were so many of them, could make no difference to his grandmother. And so it came about that most of the principal words were missing in the hymns that Peter read aloud. End of chapter 19. Read by Shallenberg on April 27, 2006, in Oceanside, California.